Hello everybody and welcome to I believe it's the 6th edition of Jan's opening clinic. You know the drill, ask me your opening questions, or you have asked me your opening questions in the news article on Chess24, and I'll do my best to answer them and be in front of the camera, which seems to be a very tough challenge already. It's a hot day in Hamburg, so apologies, I'm not dressed up today. But I am still looking forward to doing the clinic and answering your questions. First of all, let's see if anyone can hear me. So if you guys can hear me out there in the chat, let me know. Can you see me, hear me? That's about it. I think that's all we need. I'll be quiet until I get something. Someone says now he's online. That's good enough for me. So let's get started with the many questions that we hopefully have. Let's see, what is there? First question seems to be... One second, this can only take hours. Here we go. SK3, he's saying, thank you, Jan. What is the concrete plan in the boring openings, such like Queen's Gambit decline, or Exchange Slave, and so on? Or you just put the pieces in the right square? I do not have a clear plan like King's Indian defense or Dragon Sicilian, just attack the king. Thank you again. Tough question to begin with. I can't answer it really. These openings are huge. The concrete plan always depends on the situation. Putting the pieces in the right square is always a good idea. But I do agree, especially in the case of the Exchange Slav, that their plans are a bit limited because the structure is fixed in the center and there's not that many different ways, different strategic options, let's say. Normally white tries to use a small edge in development to make something happen, typically on the queen side in the Exchange Slav after, let's say, a6. Maybe you're trying to bring a knight to c5, so putting the piece on the right squares indeed is what it's about. And if you think these openings are too boring, then I can only recommend play something else that's less boring. If you're not a d4 player, play e4, and maybe there's some more lines where you get the chance to attack the king. With black, you can play the King's Indian or the Sicilian. So, I always struggle with the question of what are the concrete plans. I'm more of a move-by-move guy, and I think chess is a very concrete game. So, long-term plans, I have a bit of a problem with explaining them in openings because more often than not there's no long-term plans, but you react to your opponent's moves and try to do as well as you can. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Sorry, I already kind of dodged that one. Kursu123 is saying, hi Jan, what is called the opening where black plays a semi-Slav and after white moves the f1 bishop to either e2 or d3, black plays d takes c4 and after white takes back he plays b5, bishop b7, a6, knight bd7, c5, queen c7 and long castles? I know the answer to that. Let's try to put it on the board. If I manage, it's going to be a lot of switching today. The answer is it's called the Maran variation after d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight to c3, e6, e3, knight bd7, bishop to d3. I think that's the line you mean. D takes c4, bishop takes c4, b5, bishop to d3, and how do we get to your position? Let's say after bishop b7, there's many moves here, bishop b7, a6, bishop d6. I think the line you're referring to is bishop b7, castles, a6, e4, c5 and d5. I don't know if this has a name. I think it's the Reynolds variation, don't ask me why, but I believe that's what it's called. And d takes e, f takes e, bishop c2. Here, well, black has a range of moves. Bishop d6 is a move which we've recently seen in the game Vashila Graf against Topalov. c4 used to be the main line, and very often black does castle queenside indeed. It's a very sharp variation, which, as far as I know, is more or less fine for black, and it's called the Reynolds variation of the Maran. I believe that's what I would call it. A lot of this is built on games by Bent Larsen in the 70s, believe it or not. I recently read these Kasparov's My Great Predecessors book, and there were a lot of games of Bent Larsen in the Maran, so if you want to study that line, checking out some Bent Larsen games is a pretty good place to start. That was that. Let me clumsily try to bring up the next question. Corso asked, could you also show us the main line? I think I did. That was more or less it. G Money XXX says, what's up, buddy? I just wanted to get your opinion on the quaid attack variation of the King's Gambit. I've been considering playing it with the white pieces lately. Thanks, love, DJ. I'm very bad with opening names, so I'm not 100% sure what you meant, but I googled the, what do you call it, the quaid variation? And I believe it is the position after e4, e5, f4, e takes f4, knight f3, g5, which is a line I've been recommending and playing. Another move, knight to c3. This caught a bit of momentum. As you probably know, I'm not a huge fan of the King's Gambit. It can be a dangerous surprise weapon. Objectively, I always believe that Black has to be fine. He's a pawn up. White didn't gain such a huge lead in development, so I'm not a huge fan. This particular variation, bishop g7, I think what they're trying is the move g3. And I believe it's the most sensible to not take on g3 here, but to return the pawn if needed. The main line is something like d6, d4, knight to c6. And as far as I know, Black is doing quite alright here. Not sure what they do. I think they try bishop b5, then a6, and Black seemed to be fine to me. There's always some tricky lines, takes, g takes f4, g4, stuff like this. It can get a bit messy, but I believe Black is better here, so it's not the kind of messy I'd be overly afraid of. And if instead of bishop b5, I think they also try d5, but here knight e5. This is sort of a modern technique. You do give the pawn back, but you get a good position in return. Bishop takes f4, bishop g4. I believe this is a line I once looked at. Bishop b5 check, king f8, bishop e2. And now Black exchanges a lot of stuff. Takes, queen to f6. And Black was at least equal, I think slightly better. So I'm not overly concerned about the quaid variation, but of course over the board all these things can be very tricky and you have to be used to playing slightly crazy positions. So they have value as surprise weapons. If I was given time to prepare and I knew my opponent played the quaid, I wouldn't be that scared. Moving on to the next question. We got a lot of questions today. I have to apologize in advance. I'm not well prepared for all of them, and I'm also not sure we're gonna get to all of them, but I will do my best. Question by K. Lamar, 74, regular on these shows. Hi Jan, great to see the clinic back. Always a pleasure. I've been on the road for a while, for like a month, in Sardinia playing terrible chess, and then in Norway chess, giving terrible comments on chess. So I was gone for a while, but I'm back in the office now, and I can do more opening clinics. Of course, we have the Dortmund Sparkassen chess meeting running. Today is a rest day, which is why I'm doing this. Tomorrow I'll be back to commentary with International Master Maximilian Meinhardt. Looking forward to that. Anyway, let's get to K. Lamar's question. What is your opinion about the position from the diagram? Black to move. The move knight d3 is given as playable by Peter Svidler and was even played by Caruana. But queen e2, knight c1, rook c1, and white has 5 tempi up. Why should Black agree with such a thing? The bishop pair is too small price and white king stays well on f1, I think. Also, if not knight d3 and instead knight e6, then b4 and white has initiative. I was once able to get a winning position with white against a much stronger player from this position. Congratulations. Thank you. Yeah, I disagree with your assessment. Let's once again bring up the board and I'll give you my opinion. So many lines in my opening clinic file. So how do we get to that position? Not d4, knight f3, knight f6, c4, c5, knight c3, d5, takes. This is a line that Grunfeld players play quite often, hoping for d4, knight takes c3, followed by g6, and they get their beloved Grunfeld. So e4 is one of the sharp ways white has trying to challenge that. Knight b4 is the best move. Knight takes c3 here, by the way. D takes c3 is nice for white, believe it or not. So knight b4 is the way to go. Bishop c4, once again the critical move. Very odd line where black moves his knight all over the place, but I do believe it's quite playable. Knight d3 check, king to e2. Knight f4 check, king f1. And yeah, K. Lamar mentioned he was not a fan of the move knight d3. I'm a fan. The line you give, queen e2, knight takes c1, rook takes c1. It's true that white is, I don't know, 5 tempi up, but that doesn't matter so much. If you're up in development, it only matters if you can exchange that lead into something more tangible, whatever. And in this position, I don't think you can. I'd even give you another tempo. Play a6 just to stop any bishop b5 check. And I'd take black here every day of the week. Black's play is very easy. You want to go knight c6, e6, oops, not e5, e6. Knight c6, e6, bishop e7, castles. Play b5 if you feel like. And I think it's much easier to play with black. White, in order to open up the position, would need to get in d4, but that's going to be very hard to do once I get in knight c6 and e6. So I like black in this position. And I also think the other lines are fine for black after knight d3. Let's say queen b3 looks like a logical move. Then e6, and there's some tactics, but they all work for black. Queen b5 check, for example. Bishop d7, this is a key line. Queen takes b7, knight to c6. It turns out that black, even though he's a piece and a pawn down here, is doing very well because there's some tricks. This is a key trick. Queen a6, knight b4, queen c4, knight takes d3. Black won his piece back, and if queen takes d3, then bishop b5 happens to pick up the queen. It's pinned and attacked. So I believe knight d3 is a very good move, and I haven't seen anything convincing from white's side to question that assessment yet. The old line, as you mentioned, is knight e6, but then I agree that after b4, funny looking move, white gets very decent compensation for the pawn after c takes b, knight e2. So I thought knight d3 was actually an important move. I think Caruana played it, Anish Giri gave it somewhere, Svidler might have recommended it. I think it's a good move. I couldn't find anything against it. Moving on to the next question by who asked? Divided by 0, I guess that's what it stands for. Hi Jan, I'm looking for a decent system versus the Caro-Kann. I don't want to play the advanced variation, horrible results so far, and I just can't find my way around in those complicated positions. I understand those are tricky positions, or the classical main line, e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, d, e, 4 which is also not really my cup of tea. Is the Panov attack a valid choice, and or do you have another idea line worth investigating further? I can't remember a recent 2700 plus game with it. By the way, I do not care at all if theory says it's only dead equal. Thanks in advance and keep up the good work. Thank you, sir. I don't know, I have some opinions. After e4, c6, first of all, I would thought an underrated system was the one that Paco Vallejo plays and recommends. The system, what's it called, the two knights, knight c3, d5, knight f3. I think that's a pretty decent system. The main line used to be bishop g4, h3, takes, and now e6 or knight f6. But I never understood as a d4 player why this is supposed to be so great for black. Black does give up his two bishops pretty much for nothing. And it's supposed to be equal, but I'm not really buying it. I don't even know how they play here, just I have the feeling that this should be fine for white. I think you can go d4. Paco, I'm not sure if he has an ebook, but check out what he has to say about this. I believe this is an underrated system, and now people are catching up a bit more, and black has started playing knight f6 instead of bishop g4, when after e5, knight e4 can lead to some weird positions after knight e2, queen b6, d4, e6, knight g3, something like that. But also here, white should have decent chances to fight for an advantage. So that's one system I kind of like. The Panov nowadays, yeah, there's reasons it's not that popular. After ed, cd, c4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. The old line knight f3, then bishop g4, and black is supposed to be pretty much fine. And this move bishop g5 was trendy for a while, but here both after d takes c4 or after e6. I think black is also fine, and there's not that much territory to discover something or to surprise opponents. Another line I have a bit of sympathy for is e4, c6, c4. I think we'll have a question about that later. I think this is not so stupid after ed, cd. Just play cd. Queen d5 is bad because of knight c3, or not ideal. So they play knight f6, and I've experimented with some stuff here like bishop b5 check, knight bd7, knight c3. I think this is a playable line. Something like this. Then you want to go knight e5 and bishop to f3 after e6. I thought this was quite playable. But of course, I can't really promise an advantage there after a6, bishop e2. For example, b5 might be a good move. But yeah, those are my thoughts. If I was an e4 player, I'd probably play one of those lines if I didn't like this. 3 e5 advanced variations. Hope that helps a little bit. Let's go back to our questionnaire. Flo Power has his usual question about the Benko Gambit. Let's see what he's wondering. Hey Jan, I tried to find a tricky sideline against the Benko Gambit after the moves d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, b5. I played the 12 a4, queen e2 line. I think you had earlier questions about that in the artificial castling variation before, but there are several ways for black to avoid this line by delaying to take i6. Yeah, that's what I recommended, I think. This seems to be unpleasant in my eyes, so my question is if you can recommend a sideline which might be unpleasant for black to face over the board. Due to the fact that I like to face the Benoni, I'm looking for a line in which my pawn is already on d5, see above. Got it. Maybe you can also recommend a strong player to follow in the line that you're going to suggest. A lot of wishes. Let's see what we can do. The Benko Gambit. As you probably know, I normally don't allow it. After d4, knight f6, c4, c5, I tend to go knight f3 or one knight f3 just to avoid it altogether. So not a big specialist, d5, b5. One line I think that is a decent try here is the move queen c2, which isn't played that much, but it always made some sense to me. With a very simple idea of going e4 and occupying the center. Main line is b takes c, white goes e4, black goes, let's say, d6, bishop takes c4, black goes g6. Here it's very important not to blunder a pawn like some strong players have done with the move b3, because that runs into knight takes e4. So don't do that, but instead go knight f3, bishop g7, castles, castles. And I don't know, I like to wait a move with knight c3. Because knight c3, black might go bishop a6, and I really would like to recapture here with a knight if possible. So something like h3. In this position, I'd argue is slightly more pleasant for white, bishop a6, knight bd2. Of course, it's not guaranteeing a win, and you might ask yourself why this is so much better than the Volga if black still has a pawn on a7. It's not necessarily, but sometimes this pawn on a7 is a bit in the way, and here white has fluid development, probably after, let's say, knight bd7. Knight c3. It's easy to play, go rook e1, bishop f4, rook d1, and prepare e5. So that's a line, yeah, which I think is quite playable, and I might give an outing next time I run into the Benko Gambit. But normally I avoid running into it, so I'm not sure this will ever happen. Still, I think queen c2 is not a bad system. Some more direct lines here, e6 or something, but I don't think they're very good. Knight c3, e takes d5, e5. And white has been doing alright. I'm not sure who's playing this. I think Mamedyarov had a couple of games. He might be a player to follow. I think Dreyev had a couple of games. So yeah, check those guys out. I believe this is quite a playable line. Kevin Walker is asking, Hi Jan, how can the Bloomenfeld attack e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, ed, knight d4, bishop c5, bishop e3, queen f6, knight b5 and the Scotch saved for white. Now he gives a long line, I'll put it on the board in a minute. I really enjoy all the other variations, so I really don't want to give 6 knight b5 up. I don't mind a slightly worse position as long as it is somewhat playable and tricky. That's where we're different. I do mind slightly worse positions with white out of the opening. But let's have a look at what's called the Bloomenfeld attack. I had no idea that's the name. It's bit of a sideline of this scotch. So d4 takes, knight d4, bishop c5, bishop e3. I'm not a huge specialist because normally I go knight f6 instead of bishop to c5. But I'm familiar with this line, bishop c5, bishop e3, queen to f6, c3, knight g e7. Oh no, I'm sorry, you don't go c3, that's your big point. You do go knight b5 instead. Knight b5, that's the tricky line. Bishop takes e3, all this is more or less established. Takes queen h4, check g3, queen d8, queen to g4, g6. And yeah, the line is considered to be more or less dead because of the trick which Kevin mentioned himself after bishop c4, knight e5, castles. Bishop h3 works for black. And black is more or less winning here after bishop f7, king d7. Were some tricks and white position just didn't work. So instead, yeah, if you want to keep playing this, which I would advise against, but bishop c4 just doesn't work. So you would have to go knight to c3 here. And I believe some people have done that. And then after a6, play knight d4, play this position, go for long castles, bishop e2. I don't think white is better, but he's probably not worse. Knight e5, bishop e2, let's say. There was some game, bishop h3 here. Long castles. And you get sort of a playable position. Maybe try to undermine the knight on e5 by playing knight f3. Once again, I'm not recommending it. I think black is fine, and you should not play the move 6 knight b5. This is more of a one-game surprise weapon. But if you do insist, then yeah, don't push your luck with bishop c4, but play knight c3 here. And the position remains more or less playable. Moving on to the next question by All-Star. Hi Jan, in the Nimzo after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, e3, castles, bishop d3, d5, knight e2, dc, bishop c4, e5, what would you recommend as a plan for white in order to try to get an advantage? Don't go knight e2. Anyway, I know the main line is castles, knight c6, a3, bishop d6, d5, knight e7, knight g3. But is there much, if any, advantage here? I don't think there is, frankly. Let's have a look at it, though. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, e3, castles. Nimzo-Indian mainline, bishop d3, d5. Yes, knight e2 move used to be a bit more popular a while back. Nowadays no one, or almost no one plays it, and I think with good reason. I think knight f3 is the way to go here. Looks a bit more natural as well. After knight e2, of course, c5 is the main move, and d takes c, bishop c4. This position I also think c5 is a good move. I think I played this once. But you mentioned the move e5, and I think this is also fine, actually. Yeah, the main line, what is it? a3, bishop d6, castles, knight c6. And black gets a good version of these. You often see it in the Queen's Gambit accepted or the Ragozin. These positions with knight c6, d5, knight e7. Because the white knight on e2 is a bit misplaced. Ideally you want your knights on, yeah, c3 and c4 in the structures. It's a long way there. Having said that, this position is playable for white. Knight g3, I think they go knight f5. Now something, the computer gives knight to e4 here and gives white a small advantage. I don't think it's very much. Knight takes, bishop e7 and knight d6. But this looks more or less playable. Bishop d2, knight d6, you take. Bishop takes, rook c1. And you could argue that there's some potential weaknesses on the black queen side. And that your position is alright. Apologies. I would not play the line with knight e2. I used to play this many years ago, but I think dc and c5 or dc and e5 are both fine. And knight f3 is a more challenging line. What is next in line? Amigo Alex is saying, Hi Jan, my question is simple. It's long. Can you share your thought process starting from just a few minutes before you start a match, before sitting down and facing your opponent? Normally then I'm taking a shower and rushing to the playing hall, so I'm on time. And ending with what you are thinking during your opening moves. How can you focus 100% in those minutes? Do you have a mental list of do's and don'ts during the opening? And he likes his premium membership. Much appreciated, amigo Alex. Thanks for that. I do think we do provide pretty decent value for the premium membership. To answer the question, the truth is normally you don't have to be 100% focused during the first minutes of the game, because it's a position in 95% of the cases which I've seen before. And I will take some time just rechecking something and wondering, am I prepared for this? Am I not prepared for this? But the real fight normally starts like half an hour into the game after taking some time in the opening just to get acclimated. So I tend to be not 100% focused there. But of course, you do pay attention to how quickly your opponent chooses a line. Sometimes he chooses something unexpected, and then I go into thought, not so much about the position on the board, but what does he want, what doesn't he want, what does he have prepared, what do I know about that line or that line. So it's more like, shadow boxing in these first minutes of the game, trying to figure out where I can catch my opponent, where he wants to catch me, what positions I'd like to play, what I wouldn't like to play. And you have to be concentrated for that, but I mainly have to concentrate not to blitz out some move which I would regret later, and especially if there's a surprise by the opponent, to take a moment of time, or at least that's what I do, trying to figure out what he wants. And else I don't have any secret tricks. Cold shower. If I'm really tired and I want to be awake for the game, I do take a cold shower like 10 minutes before it starts. I think that's very refreshing but painful, so I don't use that secret recipe all the time. And I'm not sure that answers your question, but generally you have to be sharper a little after the opening, like half an hour in, and I try to do that and navigate the opening, ideally so that my opponent has to think for a long time before I do. That's why I put a lot of emphasis on preparation, so I have time to settle in while my opponent's clock is running. Next question is by Sushi Boy 8. Hi Jan, is 5G3 in the Semi-Slav a good try for the advantage? And what do you think is the most critical line? Thanks for all the great work on Chess24. You're very welcome. It does look like it's becoming fashionable, at least. Of course, like with almost all main lines, it's too early to say it's a great try for an advantage, and the more fashionable it gets, probably the more likely it is that Black will find his way around. But I do believe that it's pretty playable. Let me check my Skype if people are telling me I'm not online. No complaints yet. Is anybody there? Let me check the chat. I'm sorry, I just got confused. What's going on? No one's talking to me. I just hope I'm online and people can see me. Else, send your letters of complaints to support at Chess24. What is happening? Sorry for the interruption. I'm just trying to load my own show here. It tells me Chess24 is not available. So we'll just continue, pretend nothing has happened. If anybody's watching and has my Skype, let me know what's going on. So we were talking about d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, g3. I think, it's an interesting line. The trendy line recently has been d takes c4 here, bishop g2, b5. But since that game, which Kramnik won against Anish Giri after a6 castles, surprisingly knight takes c6 is not a great move here, because after queen b6, Black gained some time for developing and is absolutely fine. But after castles, bishop b7, b3, I believe, Black has some problems here and they haven't been solved yet. cb, ab, how does this go? Bishop e7. Does it go like this? Yeah, I think so. Bishop e7, bishop b2, castles, and now knight e4. Kramnik mixed up the move order and started with queen c2, as he mentioned in his notes. But this was tricky for Black. It's not so easy to get your pieces out. And White seemed to have very good compensation for the pawn. So I wouldn't be surprised if people returned to the older lines after, let's say, DC, or you could also start with knight bd7. Play something like this, which I think is reasonably playable for black, but I'm sure there's more developments to come here after castles, bishop e7. White typically decides between e4 and a4, or plays both of them. Often a4, castles, e4. And there's many possible lines here for black. e5 is a move, and also slower setups with a5, queen e2, b6, tending to defend the pawn for now with bishop to a6. I believe are playable, but I have to admit I haven't studied it from the black side for a while. I'm not quite sure what white wants in all those lines. Last time I checked, black was more or less doing fine here after e5 and also after a5, stuff like that. So I'm not 100% sure where they're trying to hit, but it seems like there is some potential and some ideas to be found in those lines. I should probably spend some more time there. I'm really not 100% sure, but I do believe that it's a viable try. Anything Vladimir Kramnik plays normally can be considered to be a viable try for an advantage. So by all means, check it out. And especially since nowadays white seems to be a little bit stuck in both e3 and bishop g5, as it happens with many heavily analyzed lines. I wouldn't be that surprised if g3 became even more trendy than it is right now. But I'm not a big specialist in it, so I can't tell you too much. From what I know, these old lines are fine for black, but that might change, or my knowledge might be a little outdated. And we have a question by Jordan, International Master. Hi Jan, in the Marshal, can white force an ending where he's a pawn up but black has the bishop pair, like in this example? Thank you. Force is strong. I think, yeah, the position you gave is one of the main lines of the Marshal. And white can play that line. I'm not sure he can force black into that position, but I do think that going for it is probably the best black option. So, sorry, just navigating my many lines here. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6. Here we are. The position which Jordan gave arises after something like this. Bishop e3, bishop g4, queen d3, rook a8, knight d2. Yeah, once again, forced is a bit strong. Like black has many options in these positions. Rook e6, f5, and other moves, but this is the main move nowadays. Queen h5, queen f1, when once again rook e6 is possible, f5 might be possible, but they're supposed to be not that great. So rook e7 is how people normally play some Leko games here. a4, rook fe8, takes, bishop takes d5, queen g2, and you do get the ending you desired. The bad news is I think it's nothing for white, this ending after h5 or f6. I believe black has full compensation for the pawn and there is no real problem as a Marshal player. You tend to live with such positions and I wouldn't be overly concerned about it. But I believe you have a good chance of getting that position against many Marshal players. However, you do have to know the theory around it on the way to it. Like knight d2, yeah, rook e6 is a move, rook e7 might be a move, queen h5 and then f5 is a move, f5 immediately is a move. So there's some options for black, but the best play, the consensus nowadays, is that you do get this endgame, and consensus also that black is fine here, so nothing to get too scared of as far as I know. Let's get the next question. Still a bit confused, I can't access the site. Give me 1 minute here to try to once again load my own show to see hopefully the chat and to see if I'm running at all. It's very confusing. Like, am I only talking to myself or am I talking to the tens of people out there watching this show? No, here we go. Let's see. Switch the sound off. Oof, I should get a haircut. There's some talk in strange languages, but I do believe, yeah, we're online, so that's good news. I'm sorry you guys had to witness this. Let's move on with the show. Slavov is asking, hello Jan, I'd like to hear your opinion about e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, e5. What would you recommend for white here? Thank you and keep up the good work. I shall try. Not sure what I recommend for white. It's not a position I face all that often, if ever, but I have some opinions. d4, knight f6, knight c3, e5. First of all, it's a bit of an urban legend that it's being taught around chess clubs around the world that after d takes e, that d takes e is a big mistake and only black can be better here and that this position is great for black. I don't think that's really true. I think a well-prepared white player can ask some questions in this position if you don't go on autopilot here. Because, yeah, normally people are told that this position is so easy to play for black. I don't really think that's the case. After bishop c4, attacking this pawn, bishop e6 is possible, but it's leading to some quite ugly double pawns after f3. I take white at least. And king e8, what do they do? Bishop g5. Oh no, knight f3 first, sorry. Knight f3, bishop d6, bishop g5. I believe white has some chances to play for an advantage here, so I'm always a bit surprised when I hear that, yeah, d takes e5 is a mistake in this position, as everybody knows. Still, it might not be the most ambitious move, and certainly knight f3 is the most natural when typically people go knight d7 and you get the Philidor mainline after bishop c4, where white is a bit better, but of course it's a playable system. Or if you're more adventurously inclined, you can play Shirov's move g4, which I would never do, but it is a legal move. System I have a bit of sympathy for is the move knight e2 here, just intending to follow up with g3 castles, bishop g2, g3 bishop g2 castles, sorry. I believe that's quite playable and sort of easy. Castles, bishop g2, c6, you go a4 to stop black from going b5. I don't know what they do normally, a5 castles, knight to a6 I guess. And white tries to build up a bit on the king side, h3, g4, bishop e3, knight to g3, f4. I think that's a reasonably easy to learn and playable system. White has many such things. I would probably choose between d takes e5 and the move knight ge2 if I were facing it. But it doesn't happen much since I don't go d4, one e4 much, or after d4, d6 I don't go e4 much either. What else we got? Healthio is asking, hi Jan, is there some tip that can help someone around 2000 FIDE to find good moves in the opening for himself with confidence? Thanks, Healthio Alexandre. You've come to the wrong place. I'm a guy who likes to study openings and likes to tell people to study openings, so study them, then you will be able to find good moves with confidence. The opening is by far the most difficult part of the game, so knowledge is very hard to be replaced there. And yeah, certainly for me, in order to be confident in the opening, I want to know what I'm doing. Else, yeah, I think it's like with everything in chess. If you're, don't panic, concentrate, rely on your subconscious and your pattern recognition to do the job for you, calculate variations, but I do believe that in the opening you have to be prepared, not exactly like 100 moves deep, but to kind of know what position you want to get and what position you don't want to get. And the better you are prepared, the more you looked at your opponent before the game, the more confident you can be about the opening. I might be overdoing it a little bit once in a while, and it's good to find a balance there. And of course, you shouldn't panic if you're out of book or anything like that. But I think there's no substitute for study and experience, like knowledge in the lines you've employed. Then you'll be more confident. That's all I got. I'm sorry, Healthio. Jeroen SCH is saying, hello Jan, what is your opinion on the Sokolov variation of the Slav d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, dc, a4, bishop f5, knight e5, knight b7, knight c4, knight b6? What do you think is a bad try for an advantage? Set up with f3 or g3? I'll go with f3. I think the Sokolov variation, is that what it's called? Probably is, yeah. d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, d takes c, a4, bishop to f5, knight to e5, and yeah, many options for black here. e6, of course, the main move. Knight bd7, knight takes c4, knight to b6, knight to e5, now a5 to stop white from going a5. I don't know, I used to play g3 here. Recently I liked this move f3 a bit more. I think Aronian won a game here against, can't remember against whom, but this looked convincing. f3, knight d7, knight d7, e4. I think it was Wang Hao or Wang Yue, I think one of those. Probably Wang Hao. Not sure. Bishop g6, bishop e2. This was the key move. Bishop e3 looks more natural. Bishop e2 was clever for some reason. And yeah, here the critical move seemed to be queen b6, but now white was ready to go f4, e6 and castles, threatening f5, and he seemed to be getting a bit of an advantage. If black can't do that but has to go e6, then black's position is solid but slightly worse. White just goes castles, bishop e3, mainline's queen b3, f4 is still in the air, sometimes d5 is in the air, so I thought this led to a bit of an advantage for white, and that's what I would try to do. The key move after bishop g6 was this bishop e2. This was important for some reason. So that's my amount of knowledge on the Sokolov variation. Imagination is saying, "Hi Jan, I love your commentary and your Super Grover t-shirt. Thanks. I've gone mainstream though. I'm wearing shirts and ties and I'm an old man now. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, knight c3. How should black respond? Especially if he wants a dynamic game." Dynamic game, not my forte, but let's have a look at the line. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight to f6, castles, bishop e7, and knight to c3. Not a move you see very often. I believe Paco Vallejo once played this against me, and it's sort of was known as the Spassky variation, but not the young Spassky, but more the old Spassky, who was trying to play very solidly. Knight c3, who is trying to play very solidly. Knight c3 certainly fits the bill. It's a solid move. I believe the black's best bet is the move b5. If you go d6 here, white can take on c6 and go d4. And this position might be more dynamic, but it's mainly dynamic for white, and here I'd love to be white. So I believe you should go b5, then bishop b3, d6. Now the threat is knight a5, capturing this bishop. So white has been playing in this particular position the move knight d5 more often than not. And the best reply is once again the move knight a5, capturing this bishop. Knight takes e7, queen takes e7, with a pretty equal position after d3. I think that's still enough play. You might argue it's not dynamic enough, but that's the best black has, and I think there's still enough play with the opposite color bishops and many pieces on the board to outplay your opponent. Objectively, of course, it is very close to equal, but there's nothing much to worry about, and that is the best reply. Instead of knight d5 recently, they started playing some a4, but I believe black goes b4, knight d5, knight a5 anyway, and gets a pretty decent position as well. So nothing to worry about, but it is a solid line, this knight c3 stuff. You're not gonna refute it. But yeah, by going b5, d6, there's nothing to worry about, really. What else we got? Berliner Bear is saying, "Hi Jan, what do you think about the Gorganitze variation of the Caro-Kann? e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, b5. Is e, d5, b4, dc6 the refutation? No, it's not. They lose a piece. Does white achieve a plus with a3, a6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, e6, knight f6, castles, h3, bishop takes a6. Let's put on the board. Thanks. Yeah, it's a line I must admit I've looked at once in a while, trying to surprise especially lower rated opponents to get them out of theory, I don't think it's very good. Ed b4, d takes c6, I don't understand. B takes c3 just is winning for black. So I'm not quite sure what your point is here. This does not work. I believe the problem is ed b4 and now just knight a4. C takes d5 and knight to c5. This is a position I've tried to make work, but I don't really trust it for black. Normally I go e6, white goes a3, takes, and white is just better. He's going to go b4, c3, and then develop the pieces. Knight f3, bishop d3. You have this powerful knight on c5. So it's not very pleasant. The line you gave with a3 might also lead to a bit of an advantage, but I do think that the move e takes d5 is much stronger. So I've dabbled with the idea, and I probably have played a6 here, which is also not a very good move to get people out of book, but I don't think it's a good line. Grizzly Grisou is asking, hi Jan, can you give me a good setup with black against the following line? d4, d6, bishop f4. Thanks for your help, Andreas. Who plays bishop f4 in that position? And why would you? Anyway, let's see. Not a topic I've spent a lot of thought on, but bishop f4 doesn't look good there. Problem is, I mean, like, even against the regular King's Indian with knight f6, g6, this knight f3, bishop f4 setup is not the scariest, but here black hasn't committed to knight f6 yet, so I would try to gain a tempo against that bishop by going g6, bishop g7, and if I need to, knight d7 and e5. I'd be quite happy. Bishop g7 here. Normally guys who play this, they want to go e3 and create this sort of wall, h3. But here black doesn't have to go knight f6. He just goes e5, bishop h2. You put your queen on e7, then you follow up with knight f6 and castles. I'd take black here any day of the week. Bishop e2, knight f6, castles. Say castles. I don't know what white wants, c3 or c4. Yeah, many possible options. b6 looks natural. Knight e4 looks like a good move. I don't think that's a very scary setup. Of course you can play anything with white, and white is not worse after bishop f4, but I wouldn't be very concerned about it, because d6 is sort of built to face a move like bishop f4. Then knight d7, g6, and e5 is coming, so yeah, it doesn't look very scary to me. What else we got? Mark1707 is asking, hi Jan, in the Berlin Wall, in this position, white often plays g3, but I don't understand why white doesn't take the bishop on e6 and halves the bishop pair. But after g3, bishop g5, rook g6, black has what he wants, an active rook and opposite colored bishops. This is a very, very deeply into Berlin Wall theory. A lot of high-level games have been played there. I'm not going to pretend that I really understand the subtleties, but I've seen some games in this variation. Rising in the Berlin mainline, DE, knight f5, takes, h3, h5, knight c3, king e8, bishop f4, bishop e7, rook d1, bishop e6, knight g5, rook h6. This is sort of, yeah, a trendy line, and the move Mark is suggesting is knight takes e6, rook takes e6, which, yeah, looks logical. Get rid of this bishop. The problem for white is it's not so easy to follow up and make use of your, especially your dark squared bishop can be a bit passive with a pawn on e5. Natural move would be knight to e4, but then black goes f6, and I believe black is fine exploiting this knight. So this position, I'm not quite sure what white wants. I wouldn't be surprised to see someone try it. Maybe g4 is an option here. Takes, knight h4, knight e2, something like that. Could occur on top level. And if white was in time here to go, I don't know, bishop g3 and f4, it'd certainly be better. But black is quite active with knight f3 check or f6. So I believe people have just checked this position and found out that it does work move by move for black after rook h6, knight e6, rook e6. Strategically, I'm with you. It's a desirable exchange often in the Berlin to exchange your knight for the light squared bishop. But here black just seems to be well placed to deal with the problems that could occur. g5 in the air, h4 in the air, f6, rook d8, It doesn't seem that scary, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone tried it, and it's certainly as valid a move as the move G3, which they have been playing a lot. So thanks Mark1707 for that question. Let's see if there's more. Rookie8 is asking, hi Jan, where's your take on the 8 bishop d3 line in the fried liver attack after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and so on and so forth, position on the diagram? I think that's a question I've dealt with in a couple of opening clinics already. So watch the old shows. Anyway, let's put it on the board, if I find the board. I do believe I've mentioned quite some details about this line in the old editions. It's a topical line. I'm not sure what's going on. Takes, bishop to d3 has replaced the move bishop e2 as a main line here. Yeah, black should go knight to d5, attacking this knight and preparing to put the knight here. Knight f3, bishop d6, castles, and here, yeah, there's a fork in the road. Knight recently won a nice game after something like castles, rook e1, bishop g4. I couldn't fully make it work for black when I checked with the computer. I believe, yeah, I was talking about that in an earlier show. I thought white was doing fine here, but it's very, very move by move. So I thought black should play knight f4 instead and then take on d3 and try to get compensation for the 2 pawns. I believe black is holding there, but it is certainly a very topical line, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more discussions there coming up shortly. Still, yeah, I'd like to refer to my older coverage for more detail on that. Zad is saying, hi Jan, after d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, e3, what would you recommend for black against the Colle system? And thanks for the praise. I do like praise. However, I'm going to have to disappoint you once again. I don't really know. After knight f3, I always played d5 in this position, or not always, but most of the time I played d5 or g6. So it's not really part of my repertoire, e6, e3. I believe this is one of the few versions with an early e3 that are sort of playable for white, that are right for white. Artur Yusupov has employed this setup quite a bit. What I would probably do is be boring and employ some sort of symmetrical setup. Let's say b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, castles, go d5, put this bishop on d6, the knight on d7, go castles, and c5 or knight e4, and take it from there. Can often really lead to a symmetrical position, b3, bishop d6, bishop b2, castles, knight d2, knight d7. It's a line you see quite often. Now knight to e5, c5 would be pretty typical play. I believe this is sort of okay for black, but I don't have much experience. I've never had it on the board. I think I've once seen something like this, f4. I wanted c takes d, e takes d, and knight to e4. And I thought black was okay. It's a funny situation because white is a tempo up, but to use that is not so simple. And if white goes c4, black can probably go knight e4 himself. Well, if white goes knight e5, black goes c5, so you break the symmetry at some point and get what I believe is more or less an equal position. But once again, disclaimer, I don't have much experience. b6 followed by c5 and leaving the pawn d7, or c5 immediately is certainly also a playable setup. I would probably go for this boring stuff with b6, bishop b7, d5, bishop d6 and take it from there. What else we got? Evok. Or Ewok. Ah, those are the creatures from, what's that, Star Wars? The Ewoks? It's those little bears, right? Not sure. Hi Jan, love the show. As an E5 player, it is often frustrating to play lower-rated players. Well, only if you don't win. Many don't go into the Ruy Lopez, instead go into the Italian or Giuco Piano, which doesn't offer black the best winning chances if white wishes so. Especially his line with c3 and d4, which is why I'm considering the 2 knights to avoid it. However, the normal Italian lines seem pretty dry for black. Would you recommend learning a different opening or stick with it? Even the 2 knights Scotch can be annoying. Thanks. Yeah, I have all the same problems. Tends to be a game time decision. So, what I do, yeah, I do mix in my 1c5s or 1c6s, especially if there's a prospect of a very boring game. Then again, yes, I keep preaching, even in these boring positions, if you're an e4, e5, a classical player, it can't be too bad to get equality out of the opening. But I do hear what you're saying, and it is tough to play the Scotch 4 knights or the slow Juco pianos after knight f6, d3. Recently, what have I done? I've experimented with this move, h6, just playing to go g6, bishop g7, castles, d6, not d5, d6, and keep some more pieces on the board. Sometimes I just play the normal Italian, but most of the time, yeah, if I think it's too drawish and I'm, whatever, 300 points higher rated, then I will go 1c5 and mix it up a little bit, or 1c6. So I think as an e4, e5 player, I think it's a great first line of defense to have, but it does help to have a second opening. For example, the Taimanov Sicilian, check out Robin van Kampen series, I believe is a pretty sound backup opening to, well, become less predictable and to spice up the game if you're a favorite and don't feel like playing the Juco piano. That's what I do, but once again, Juco piano, even there, plenty of pieces left on the board, plenty of play left, but I do dabble mixing in the occasional Sicilian or Caro-Kann. Oh, and I should have put the board on full screen, but at least you guys could see something, while normally if I show something, it is full screen me and no one sees anything, like here. Luke71 is the next question on the list. Hi Jan, I need something to avoid the open Sicilians. Have you considered 1d4? What do you think of e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, bishop takes d7, 5 castles, and then 6 c3 for white? I'm assuming you mean from the following, that black takes back with a knight on d7. Yeah. No strong opinions there. Let's put it on the board. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, bishop takes. The first things you have to keep in mind, nowadays after bishop b5 check, most people play knight d7, not bishop d7. Knight d7 became very popular here. And after bishop d7, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7 is the main move, not knight takes d7, intending to put this knight on c6. So those are the lines I'd be more concerned about. After bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, castles, knight gf6, rook e1, e6. I believe later we have another question about this line, if I'm not mistaken. c3, this is a playable line, absolutely. I probably would go c4 because it's more my style to try to get this Marocci structure after knight c3 and d4, even though black could go knight e5 and try to fight it. But here I think white has some chances as well. So I probably go for c4, but c3 is certainly possible. Bishop e7, d4, takes. Black has to go d5 here if he wants to play for equality, else white just goes knight c3, has a perfect center and nothing to fear. And yet these positions, I don't know, they are playable for white, and some people have had some success here, especially because the knight on d7 is misplaced. It would much rather be on c6. Just one big reason why they more often than not play queen takes d7 to put the knight here. And yeah, white players have found some success here, trying to build up a kingside attack, sometimes even with goofy maneuvers like g3, h4, knight h2, queen g4. It's not really in my style, and yeah, I have a bit of an allergy towards this bad bishop situation, but objectively I believe this position is kind of playable for white and does promise reasonable chances for an attack. So I wouldn't advise against it. I would try it how you fare there and how it feels. I believe it's probably, yeah, objectively could even be dangerous for black. It's not in my style, so I would go e6, c4 instead, which is, but nothing wrong with that line. But once again, I'd be more concerned about knight d7 or queen takes d7 if I was white in those lines. Rendsburger is asking a long question. Hi Jan, what do you think about the Tarrasch defense? Not a big fan. I've seen it being recommended several times. Who's doing that? Because black can play the Tarrasch not only against d4, but also in a similar manner against c4 and knight f3. Sounds like a good practical choice for the average player. Yeah, I get that reasoning. I think, yeah, the positions you get are kind of limited, which maybe is what you want, but not something I'd be too thrilled about. Because, yeah, many are with an isolated pawn on d5, which is not much to my liking. Anyway, but lately the line d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, c5, cd, ed, knight f3, knight c6, dc5 has become topical and scoring very well for white. Most games continue d4, knight a4, bishop c5, knight c5, queen a5, bishop d2, queen c5, rook c1. In my eyes, this position is very unattractive for black, and I think black can only fight for a draw right from the opening. What is your opinion? Is the Tarrasch worth a try if black wants more than a draw? Are there better moves or interesting deviations for black between moves 6 and 9? Thanks and all the best. Thank you. And I do agree with everything you've said. The dc5 line is a easy line to play, and I've played it myself with white. I think, I'm not sure if twice. I've prepared it more than once for sure. I've recently had a Bundesliga game, and I don't think black has anything better than going for this d4. I've checked the alternatives. They don't really seem to work. Knight f6, bishop e3 is just good for white, and d4 is sort of forced. D4, knight a4, bishop c5 is also forced, b5, or the tricky moves here don't really work. So you have to go for this, knight c5, queen a5 check. And yeah, here both queen d2 and bishop d2 are interesting. Objectively, I believe black can hold this position after queen c5, rook c1, queen b6. How does it go? e3. What do they do? Take here? I don't know, maybe they go here first. Can never remember anything as usual, but you get some endgame like this. Which, objectively, I think is tenable for black. King takes or knight takes, but I wouldn't want to defend it right out of the opening either. I do like my two bishops, and I do believe that white is a bit better here with little risk. I'm not sure if I mixed up the move order, by the way. Could be that in this position bishop d2 was good, but you get the idea. You get something like this. And yeah, I agree with you. Black has to go for that, and it's not very attractive, so I wouldn't play the Tarrasch defense, frankly. You can analyze this position. It's tenable, but I wouldn't do it, and it is a problem, at least practically, for Tarrasch players. There's no real way to avoid it. Sorry. Then Niklas is helping me out answering some questions. We should get Niklas his own opening clinic if he's so eager to help. Thanks, Niklas. More answers here. I'm not sure I've even seen the question. Did I miss it? Yeah, I missed some questions. Let's scroll through them. No, I think I've answered everything that came my way so far. Discombobulated is asking, is 6a4 a decent move to try and open the queen side and make use of the long diagonal? Thanks. I have no idea. I've seen this move played, this move a4. I honestly don't really get that position or that move. But since people do play it, I believe it is a decent move to play. I've looked at that position and I've tried to figure out what the point is. It was too subtle for me. I like playing in the center. I like playing c4 here. To go knight c3. I'm guessing it's a decent move. I honestly, yeah, it's too complex for me. I don't understand what it's about. Why you do it. What the idea is. It is too subtle for me. Black, I'd be tempted to go d5 probably here because I'd be so confused. So I don't know. I think it's a decent move. I've seen strong players play it. I don't get it. I don't get it at all. It's over my head, really. Moriarty is asking. Moriarty. Hi Jan, I like playing the Catalan as white, but I would like to avoid the lines where black captures early on c4. For example, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, g3, bishop e7, bishop g2, d takes c4. That position, that's not a very good move. You shouldn't try to avoid that. Or d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, g3, d takes c4. Yeah, that's the main line. To this end, I was considering adopting the move order d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, g3, e6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castles, castle c4. Not a good idea. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this move order? I'm particularly concerned about whether white has enough winning chances in the fianchetto Grunfeld. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, castles, castles, c4. And also, what to do if black tries to play Slav with d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, g3, c6, or bishop f5. What do you think? Yeah, I think this move order is no good. After d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, g3. I don't think you'd get a lot of g6 here because normally Grunfeld players don't start the game with d5 and knight f6. And yeah, the Slav approach you've mentioned is very reasonable with c6 and bishop f5 or bishop f5 immediately. To my mind, the main problem with this move order would be that black can just go c5, right? And here I wouldn't know what to do with white. I mean, of course, there's no problems after bishop g2, c takes d4. Well, knight takes d4, e5 leads to a reverse Grunfeld, which is obviously fine for black. You can play castles, which is a bit more subtle, and there's some funny lines here, like h6, waiting for white to capture on d4 to answer knight takes d4 with e5. And yeah, white tries to delay the capture with bishop f4. But I think this stuff is fine for black. And yeah, summing up, I think you pay too high a price for trying to avoid one particular line. If you want to play the Catalan, I think you should go for it via the main move order. Or what people do is play Kramnik style, delay d4. Let's say knight f3, d5. You can go c4 against guys who play e6, which would be a lot of guys who play these Queen's Gambit setups, and now go g3, knight f6, bishop g2. Still ends with dc4, but they're a bit different here. After queen a4 check or knight a3, well, if black goes bishop e7, now you castle, castle, d4, and you get the position you've hoped for. But if you do like the Catalan, that's part of the deal. Just check these lines. And actually, these lines are the ones where white gets to have more fun, in my opinion, than in the other ones. After d takes c4, bishop g2, white nowadays has pretty good chances of getting an advantage in all these lines. a6, c5, bishop b4 check. All of those are quite playable for white. And bishop e7, bishop g2, d takes c. It's a rare move order. I've never seen this. White, I guess, can just go queen a4 check or knight e5 here. This doesn't look like a problem. So yeah, my advice, as usual, would be stick to the main lines. Don't worry about this. Don't try to get too tricky by going d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, g3. You're giving up way more than you gain. And yeah, the Slav approach with c6, bishop f5 is very solid, and c5 is a good move. So yeah, I wouldn't do that. What we got, Pero Amor is saying, hello Jan, during the broadcast of the 4th round of Dortmund, you were commenting about the game who you found Wesley So. I remember that the classical Caro-Kann with long castling was not too pleasant for black. I don't think that's what I said. I think I said there's some questions still to be asked, but that it has fallen out of fashion compared to the 3 e5 lines. Anyway, recently I have been adding 1 e4 to my repertoire, and somehow I'm going nowhere in my analysis of this line. I understand that. Would you point out 1 or 2 lines where you would expect to put under some pressure black in this line? Maybe there is no real advantage, but where would you search for a little something, or at least an interesting idea? Well, I've given my preferences against the Catalan earlier in this show, so probably that's where I would go. But hang on. In this line you were mentioning after e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, sorry, d takes e, knight takes e4, bishop f5, knight g3, bishop g6, h4, h6. This long old main line. Yeah, bishop d2 is the only move to play nowadays. Bishop f4 has been neutralized by queen a5 check, bishop d2, bishop b4, and there's nothing. So they go bishop d2, knight f6, castles, bishop e7. I think the most critical and flexible move here is the move king b1, which is where I lost the game against Kayakin, amongst other things. I played the move castles, which I don't think is a bad move, but what Kayakin played against me, this line, knight e4, takes, queen e2, queen d5. And now this cute little idea with bishop e3, I think was asking some questions. Nothing too serious, but it felt more or less playable for white. What black players have been doing instead, though, after king b1 recently, there's been a lot of games with queen b6, delaying castles for a bit. That's also the way Wesley So played, planning rook to d8 before committing with the king. And here, after queen b6, the white has been trying to get somewhere in these lines, rook he1, castles, knight f5. But last time I checked, black was doing alright. This is, yeah, heavy theory at the moment, rook e2, knight e4, but it seems to me like black is holding. I haven't spent much time here, so I wouldn't rule out that you can find some ideas for white. g3, knight f6, knight h4, queen d7, I believe this is how it goes. But I thought black was doing fine here, so at the moment, yeah, I'm also a bit short for ideas in the classical Caro-Kann mainline, and I think it's with good reason that people are going 3e5 or are playing other things. As I mentioned, I like this system with 2 knight c3, 3 knight f3. I think that's an underrated system, and that's what I would recommend. Or I've given some goofy Panov lines as well, if that's more to your liking. Here, I don't know. I'm not an e4 player, so I haven't spent much time looking for ideas with white, but I believe black is supposed to be fine. Ali H99999 is saying, Jan, you seem so sad without Trent around. Maybe this question can help. I'm alright, but yeah, we do miss Lawrence here at Chess24. I'm not sure your question is gonna cheer me up that much, but I'll take it anyway. c4, c5, long line, I'll put it on the board. Where here does white have something better than bishop g5 back with a draw? Thanks. The answer is no, he does not. How do we get there? I'm sorry, I got confused. Knight f3, what's the move order to get to this position? This is the one I normally would go for. But there are others. You could even get this position from the Panov attack. Queen b3, here knight takes c3 is arguably the main line, bishop c4, knight d5. But e6 is a viable option as well, and in the position you've given after bishop g5, bishop e7, is this position? Bishop h6, bishop f8. Yeah, I think white has nothing. Takes. I believe black is fine here. There were some games, normally they play bishop b5, threatening to take here, knight c7, castles. I don't even know how they play king g7. And black wants to follow up with b6, bishop b7, or bishop d7, depending on the situation. Of course, it's a playable position for white, but I think black is fine. So, no, I think this line is alright for black. I believe the critical line is to play this stuff, like bishop b5, bishop g7, castles, let's say castles. Takes here and knight a4. I think Aronian had a game here against Caruana. This structure is very tricky to understand and evaluate, but I do consider this to be a more critical test. Something like this. And things weren't so easy for black. So I think this should be the main line of this e6 system. The line you've given with bishop g5, I think black is fine. What's next? Tam2 is saying, Hi Jan, a simple question. In the knight of with 6 bishop g5, why is black supposed to reply with e5 and not the typical, with e6 and not the typical knight of e5, driving the knight away? How can white take advantage of e5? Thanks. I think that's one of the questions where Niklas was helping out already, but let's put it on the board. After e4, c5, knight to f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight to f6, knight c3, a6, bishop g5. e5 is indeed not a good move because of the move knight f5. And a decent rule of thumb is if you go e5 on the knight off, you should be able to answer knight f5 with the move d5. That doesn't work here because white has too much control over this square, so d5 wouldn't work. I guess just knight takes d5. Similar things can be, and yeah, just to elaborate a bit more, bishop f5 ef is also good for white because you're not going to get control over this d5 square. Similar story about bishop c4, for example. Here e5 is also a bad move because of knight f5, and once again white has control over this square. But if white doesn't go for one of those moves, goes bishop e2 or g3 or h3, then e5 is always a valid move. For example, after bishop e2, e5, knight f5, now d5 is possible. And a similar story after bishop e3, e5. Here no one would go knight f5 because once again d5 is a good move. So as a rule of thumb, if you can get in d5, then e5 is viable. If you can't on the next move, then it's a problem. And after bishop g5, yeah, no one plays e5. It is with good reason that people go knight bd7 or e6 here. And that's the tricky part of the knight off. You got to be ready to play both positions with e6 or with e5. Well, you can probably do without e5 if you want to, but not without e6. What else we got? IWNCTI is saying, "Hi Jan, I was wondering what is black's best response in this variation, d4, knight f6, c4, e6, d5. That's not a very good variation. In one of the last shows I looked at d4, knight f6, c4, g6, d5, which is surprisingly decent, or at least it was news to me. This is playable, but after e6 I think d5 is just bad. Black takes, pawn takes, bishop b4 check, and white already has some problems. You can't go bishop d2 or probably even knight d2 because d5 is hanging, so you would have to go knight c3 and black just castles. You're not in time to get an e4 because black controls that square. If you play a move like knight f3, well, I would go c6, but d6 must also be fine. I believe black is already slightly better here. So in that position, d5 just doesn't work. Black is too fast developing. That's why sometimes in the Queen's Indian they play knight f3, b6, a3, bishop b7, knight c3. Now d5 is a threat because you've stopped bishop to b4. And if black were to play bishop e7 here, now you're in time to go d5. But after 2e6, white is not in time to do that, and you're not going to see that much. Robin Nilsson 94 is asking, "Hello Jan, what do you think of the line e4, d5, ed, queen d5, knight c3, queen a5, bishop c4, knight f6, d3, c6, bishop d2 and the Scandinavian for white? And what plans are connected with it for both sides?" Once again, I'm never a big fan of the what plans are connected to anything for both sides. Normally there are no, well, not that like there are no plans, but the plans can heavily change on any given move. So bishop c4, knight f6, d3. I must admit I don't have much of a clue about this. I've heard some people argue that d3 is smarter than d4 in these Scandinavian positions with the queen on a5. I'm not sure. I always thought d4, c6, bishop d2 was a pretty reasonable setup for white as well. But d3, c6, bishop d2, I don't know. I honestly don't know what the plans are. It does look playable. I guess black would probably go bishop, queen back to c7, and you could try to make use of having your pawn on d3, not on d4, by playing something like knight e4. Looks like a playable position, and white is probably slightly better. But yeah, does anybody play the Scandinavian with queen a5 nowadays? I haven't seen it for ages. Like, I've seen people go queen d6 or queen d8, but queen a5, I thought there were just too many problems. And, well, also in the main lines with bishop d2 here or even knight f3 here. I thought it was just a bit out of fashion. But it's an interesting idea. I'm sorry I can't help you out there much. It does look playable. d3, c6, bishop d2. I don't really have a clue. Queen c7 looks like the normal move. Bishop G4 could also be a move, but I'm out of book here. Bishop F5. Probably the white idea is to go knight D5, queen D8, knight takes F6, GF, and play something like knight E2, which looks pleasant for white. So I do believe that knight D5 is a threat after bishop D2, and black should go queen C7. Looks playable, looks interesting, the setup with D3. I've never studied it in much detail, so sorry I can't help you out there much, but it does look like a very decent idea. Iromena is asking, hi Jan, I'd like to know which is the best dynamic line to fight the Petroff. Why does everyone want to play dynamically? 5 knight c3 maybe? And more specifically, how do you recommend to set up our pieces? Which would be the strategical features and plans to consider in the 3d4 line when black plays with h6 and long castles? I'm sorry, I don't get the question. I'm very, very confused. Anyway, I'll try to figure out what you mean. So, first part of the question I can answer. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. Yeah, I think the system with knight c3 is a good system. I think it's easy to play. And I think it's the main reason why the Petroff is not as popular as it used to be a couple of years ago. White goes d takes c, bishop e3 or bishop f4, queen d2, long castles. This king is very, very safe because it has this extra defender on the queen side. Put your king on b1 and then try to make something happen. Either on the king side, if black castles short, you often go h4, h5, or in the center, if black tries to go knight c6, bishop e6, then you often go knight d4 or knight g5, challenging the bishop. So I think this is a very good system and reasonably easy to play. If I was an e4 player, I'd be doing this for sure. What I did not get, apart from the fact that I never know any plans, was the second part of the question of after d4, black goes h6 and castles queenside. What line would that be? Bishop d3, d5, knight e5, something like this. Here, I think black is not supposed to castle queenside. I think black is supposed to play bishop d6 and is in good shape. There are some lines, some old lines, where they play queen h4. I'm not sure if this is what you mean. Not much of a specialist here. But I do believe those lines were considered to be risky for black at the very least. And that nowadays black should play bishop d6 here, and this is supposed to be fine. This was Yusupov's line, c4, c6. What do they do? Takes, takes. Knight c3, castles, some stuff like this. I have terrible memory. Now we're entering territory where I'm less well prepared for the questions. This one I really couldn't figure out. How does it go? We'll never find out, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you mean by h6 and castle queenside. The only thing I could think of is a line like this, or queen to f6, which I vaguely recall having seen, but I don't think they're considered to be very good for black, so I've never looked at them. I thought black is supposed to go bishop d6 in that position. And once again, this is very move-by-move stuff, so plans and strategic features, I don't know. And yeah, while I'm on that topic, Pramod NVS is also asking a question. Hi Jan, will you please inform us the subtleties of e6, d6, knight c6 in the Sicilian defense, and when is black supposed to play e5, and when should he play e6, when to play knight d7, and when on c6? Thanks in advance. Well, I've talked a bit about e6 or e5 earlier in the show. Else is a question which one could fill, I don't know, hundreds of hours probably. It's just tons of major system in the open Sicilian, and they're all very, very different. After e4, c5, knight f3, the position after knight c6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, e5, knight db5, d6. The Sveshnikov is very, very different from the position after d6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, the dragon, or a6, the Najdorf. So yeah, there's like 20 major openings connected to all these moves. One thing that's important to keep in mind, after both d6 and knight c6, white can go, and often does go, bishop b5. While after e6, that's not an option, so I often go e6 if I want to get an open Sicilian. I believe your chances are higher by going e6. And here, knight c6, check out Robin's excellent series on the Taimana, for example. That is an excellent, system I think one can play without too much theoretical knowledge. But of course, there's, even after e6, d4, there's many systems here. You can play the Scheveningen, you can play the a6 Khan. There's always very many different systems. In some lines, the knight goes to c6, and some goes to d7. As a rule, if you always put it on c6 and never on d7, you're not giving up that much. So I hope that helped, but yeah, it's tough for me to answer questions on literally 100 different opening systems and then give plans and rules of thumb. Hiran Liang is saying, "Hi Jan, I'm having trouble playing white against the Petroff. Play this knight c3 stuff, it's good." Well, let's show the question. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. I currently play knight e5, d6, knight f3, knight e4, and then knight c3, knight takes, d takes c. Excellent. With the idea of attacking the black king side. I don't know if this system is the best, and I'm not getting good results with it. Any recommendations? Thanks. I think the system is the best, and yeah, I'm not sure why you're not getting good results. But I do think, that this is not only the easiest system to play, but also the most unpleasant for black. Of course, depending on your style, I don't know, if you're an endgame guy, you might like the move queen e2 here. You can take the queens off and still have some small chances for an advantage in those lines. Or if you like this symmetrical structure better, you can do this, d4, d5, bishop d3, and check knight c6 or bishop d6 here. Also very playable, but the modern argument against the Petroff really is this line, knight takes, bishop e7, bishop e3. And as you said, if black castles kingside, you go queen d2, long castles, and then very often h4, try to make something happen here. If black tries to castle queenside, knight c6, queen d2, bishop e6, let's say long castles. Well, queen d7, first of all there's bishop b5, and also there's this typical idea of knight g5 in many lines, when at least you grab the two bishops. Should also lead to a small edge. There's many subtleties here after a6 to avoid bishop b5, knight d4 is a move for king b1. It's a tricky position, but I think it's easier to play for white, and I would certainly advise you to stick with it, study some games of strong players, and get more comfortable with it, but no reason to change. This is the main system they play nowadays. Whom else we got? NM Ruck is asking, "Hi Jan, why don't you like the move 1e4? I'm not against the move 1e4. It's a bit of coincidence. As a kid, my first chess book was a book called Kasparov's Chess Openings, and in that book the move 1d4 was given. So I learned that and stuck with it ever since. Nowadays, I'd like to be more flexible and be able to play 1e4 a bit. My main problem would probably be the Sicilians. It's just very hard to wrap my head around the open Sicilians at my advanced age if you haven't gained experience there as a kid. It's very distinct style of play, which doesn't suit me all that much. But no, I think 1e4 is a good move. But there's just as many annoying defenses against d4. Like the Berlin also doesn't lead to the most exciting attacking games, and the Sicilian, the Najdorf especially, or the Taimanov would be pretty tough for me to play with white, I feel like. So I've never become an e4 player. Not completely ruling it out. I might experiment with it a little bit, but for now I have no such desires. But I have no problem with 1e4 or e4 players. Fist and Antilus 2000. Complicated name. What's that about? Fist and Antilus. Anyway, is asking, "Hi Jan, first of all I have to say I love your video series on the Marshal. Thank you, great job. As for the question, what do you think of the Voral attack? Is it dangerous? Can you suggest some practical lines on how to play against it? Thanks." First of all, I don't know what the Voral attack is, so please normally give me a line or a position that I can relate to it. Opening names are so confusing. I do believe that it is the setup with queen e2 after castles bishop e7, so I'll operate under that assumption, queen e2 here. I don't think it's very scary, and I've never studied it in that much detail. But yeah, black goes b5 and castles. White normally goes c3, hinting at d4. The good thing for black here is that he's in time to go d5, which as a martial player is the move you want to go anyway. Now e takes d, I don't think is very good. After knight takes d5, knight e5, knight f4, black is already seriously better, so this is nothing you want to do, or it's something you do want to do with black. If I'm not mistaken, I would have to look it up, but I think this is not the line to play. I'm going to have to check, but white always goes d3 in this position, this is what I know. And yeah, it leads to slow play. I'm not overly concerned with black, but I also don't know that much. I know you go bishop b7, then you go rook e8, then you go bishop f8, then you have a look around. Normally you go knight a5, followed by c5. Sometimes you want to go knight b8, followed by knight bd7. Sometimes you just want to go h6, g6. So that's more or less the extent of my knowledge. White normally does something goofy like rook d1 or a3 or rook e1. You go rook e8, then you go knight bd2, you go bishop f8, then you go knight f1. And here in this position, for example, I think you go knight a5 and then bishop c2, c5. And yeah, I'm quite comfortable with it. The one thing I do know is that in this move order, d5 is supposed to be fine for black. d6 is playable as well, but d5 is just alright. White has to go d3, and then you just develop the pieces. So yeah, sorry, I've never paid that much attention to it. I'm not overly concerned about it, but maybe I should. Is this the Voral attack? I hope this is the Voral attack. But yeah, my rule of thumb is go castles, d5, develop your pieces, ed5 doesn't work there, and take it from there. Question by Pascal. Hey Jan, a question about the Queen's Gambit declined. I play the Tartakower, that's the position on the board, since ever, and on club level I get nice results with it. Typically for my games is that white doesn't exchange on d5 and let black finish the development with bishop b7, knight bd7, rook c8, c5. Should white be more aggressive here? This line was popular in the 70s. Who is the move? Why is the move b6 no longer so popular on top game? Isn't it? I think it's still quite popular. And yeah, he has found some games by Kazimchanov, Adam So, Sandepan. But yeah, it is played a little less these days. Let's put up the position. Oops. First of all, I do think it's a good line. I think there's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. The reason why it's slightly less popular nowadays is that the Lasker exchange variation has become so popular. That's one reason, and the other reason is that bishop g5 is not that popular anymore. White tends to go bishop f4. This has become the main line, so you do see less games in the bishop g5 lines than you used to a couple years back. After e3, yeah, on top level I think guys like the move knight e4 slightly better, but not because it's a better move, but because it's just very forcing and leads to simplified positions that are quite easy to play, and you can analyze those very, very far and sort of, yeah, make a draw out of the opening, which very often is appealing to the top guys, or to some of them at least. And we've recently seen the game Carlsen Nakamura. Carlsen got absolutely nothing here. So I think that's one big reason why b6 is a little less popular. b6 itself, yeah, I think it's an absolutely playable system. Pascal mentioned that after bishop e2, bishop b7, yeah, if black is allowed to develop, let's say, whatever, they go castles, knight bd7, and then c5, or knight e4. I think white is absolutely nothing, so to my mind, the critical setup is play bishop e2, bishop b7, and now take on f6. This looks a bit strange. Give up the two bishops voluntarily. The point is that this bishop is now a bit misplaced on b7, cd, ed, and b4. This is a line they played a lot in these Kasparov-Karpov matches, and that is still kind of en vogue. Black has a choice between c5, which is playable. It tends to lead to slightly worse positions for black, but ones that are very much tenable. This is a line that Kasparov and Karpov played a lot with both colors. And the a bit more interesting c6, often intending a5, or just knight d7, rook e8, where, Yeah, I don't think white is anything special. I think it's a playable position for both lines, for both sides. And we've had some battles on top level here as well. From a white perspective, I've never been really excited about these lines, and I tend to go bishop f4, or I tend to get cute with the move order and start with knight c3. So after d5 I can take. But I don't think that there's anything wrong with b6. A lot of very strong players like Leko or Kazimchanov. A lot of top Queen's Gambit players are still playing it on a regular basis. No problems there. Recently Grishuk played g4 here. Not a very good move, but it is the g4 craze that maybe has even reached the old lines of the 70s. Like the, what's it called, the Tartakower. Right after g4, knight g4, black is absolutely fine. So yeah, nothing wrong at all with the Tartakower. The reason it's gotten slightly less popular is that the knight e4 line has gotten more popular, but it's not really a chess reason. What else we got? Niklas. Niklas answering my questions. And Colin is asking a question. It's not really a chess question. So Jan, could you give us some tips on how to play the opening in a game of Bughouse tandem chess? I'm not very good at it. I think Colin is referring to a picture on Twitter where I was playing Bughouse together with Fabiano Caruana against Levon Aronian and his partner. Levon Aronian is probably one of the best players in the world, if not the best in the world, in Bughouse, so he's very, very good and he's hard to deal with. Fabiano, I was unlucky. I played with him at the start of the evening when he hadn't played much Bughouse before, so he was a bit of a novice, but since he's a smart kid and very strong player, at the end of the evening I think he teamed up with Levon and they crushed everyone. So he learned very, very fast. As for the opening, I'm not much of a Bughouse theoretician. It really depends so much on the rules. Can you insert a piece with mate? Can you not insert a piece with mate? Is your partner a weaker player, so you want to be the attacker or you want to be the defender? I don't know. The lines I don't typically play is something like knight f3, knight h6 to cover f7, and if they go e4, I want to go knight g4 and put pressure on f2. I'm not sure that's a very good line. Often they play e4, then I'll go knight f6 with the deep idea of e5, knight e4. And once again, putting pressure on f2. So I have a very subtle approach to the game. Caruana had an opening which I didn't like much as his partner. After e5, he played d5, giving up this knight. Which, yeah, looks nice and solid, but the problem is that knight would always show up on my board on f4 in Levon's hands and crush me a couple moves later. So that didn't go ideally. But yeah, Caruana chose this very defensive setup. I'm not sure if he's studied some new Bughouse theory, but I'm not gonna claim to be an expert on the level of Mr. Pavel Steno, for example. I'm just an enthusiastic amateur. Moving on. Intermove is saying, what is he saying? Hi Jan, normally I play the Ponziani against e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, 3, c3. What do you think of this opening? Don't have a very high opinion on it, but yeah, it's not a terrible opening either. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, c3. Just doesn't look so logical. Like developing this bishop here or there does strike me as more logical, while c3 is not doing that much. It's preparing d4, but it gives black a move. I believe the most logical answer is the move d5. And I think black is fine. Bishop b5 doesn't really work. D takes e. Knight e5. Now there's some complicated lines with queen d5 or queen g5, which I think are just good for black, so you can't do that. While after d5, normally they play queen a4. Here's a couple of interesting lines. Some gambits with knight f6. Knight takes e5, bishop d6, which I think are playable. Or there's a simple move f6, just defending. I'm sorry. Just defending the e5 pawn, which I also think is a good line for black. So yeah, I've never been overly concerned about the Ponziani. Sometimes you see guys playing d3 here, sort of a reverse Philidor, which is of course something you can do, but also doesn't strike a lot of fear in people's hearts. Yeah, Ponziani, you can do it once in a while as a surprise weapon. I don't think it's that good. Satirica is saying, "Hi Jan, as Ruy Lopez players we have to face 5 castles, bishop e7, d3 very often these days. I know. In Blitz I rarely even reach the main lines due to this variation. 5 d3 doesn't bother me so much. Okay. Peter Svidler has provided a full account of this line as we know, and a really nice one. But what's your personal recommendation and weapon of choice against the fashionable d3? I don't know, I keep changing my mind, and I can only refer you to Peter's series where, yeah, he's covered everything. It's from the white point of view, but Peter's always very honest, so he's also given his opinions on what the best black lines are and where white doesn't have anything. I think it's just a full-fledged mainline, and theory is gonna keep evolving. Recently I've sort of liked this setup with, how does it go, d6, they play a3, castles, knight c3, bishop g4. This looked like a very decent line to me. Bishop e3, knight to d4, bishop takes e takes d, knight d5, knight d7, h3 takes here, queen takes, c6. I'm not sure, probably. Peter spoke about this line as well, knight to f4. And yeah, I think this is a playable position for black, knight to c5. But I could change my mind very, very quickly. I'm sorry, I think you go bishop f6 first. See, I don't even know the first moves of that line. But when I was looking at it, I couldn't see anything special for white. And it looked like black was in time to generate enough counterplay on the queen side. Something like a5, a4, rook b8 or queen b8, go b4, put the knight on c5. This seemed playable to me, but I keep changing my mind. We've seen some games in Norway chess where people have tried all sorts of different things as well. So I'm not sure. At the moment that's probably what I would go for, but it could be different tomorrow. I'm really not sure. It's a tough line for me to wrap my head around, and I can only recommend Svidler's handling of it. He really is a great Ruy Lopez specialist, even though he was getting in trouble in some of these games against Dominguez. But check out his series. He really knows his stuff better than me. Surya22 is asking, "Hi Jan, I'm a King's Indian defense player, and what exactly should I reply for this tricky move order with 1g3? 1g3. White is looking to transpose into perch after g3, knight f6, bishop g2. You cheated there. g3, knight f6, bishop g2. You can't go bishop g7 yet. You have to go g6 first. Bishop g7, e4, and if 1 g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, d4, aiming for knight f6, e4 again. I don't know, like, wouldn't be very high on my list of concerns, but I've never really given it much thought, frankly. g3. Well, for starters, after g3, there is the move d5. I understand that's not King's Indian territory, but I believe this is a pretty good move to play against g3. Else, yeah, to exploit this move order, I'm not sure if you can. g6, bishop g2, bishop g7. Concern is d4 here, yeah? Because here e4 you can go c5, and that you should be happy with as a King's Indian player. And d4 in this position, I don't know. Knight f6, e4, is this a big problem? Well, maybe you have to learn this line. It's not the scariest off-perch lines, but yeah, if you don't like that, you could think about a move like c5 here, I guess, which arguably leads to a more King's Indian type of position after d5, d6. But yeah, I would probably go after g3, just d5 really. And I understand it's not in the spirit of the King's Indian, but does it happen to you very often that white players go g3 just to trick you there? I'm not sure it does, and I think you might be willing to give up your repertoire there and then punish them for going 1 g3 by playing e5 or d5 with a good position. But else, yeah, it's an interesting move order. I've never thought about it, and I don't think you can avoid getting move ordered into that thing. Still, here you... Depends what white wants to trick you into. You could go c5, I guess, and then after e4, knight c6, you can still go g6. So I'm not sure. It depends very much on the white player's repertoire and what you're comfortable with. But yeah, you can't stop white from going g3, bishop g2, e4 if you're not willing to put a pawn on the 5th rank. So I do understand your problem. Leclou is saying, hey Jan, I got a question regarding this line of the bishop b5 check Sicilian. And I think I might have to refer you to my earlier answer to this. After e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop b5, bishop d7, bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, how to continue with white. After queen takes d7, I go for castles and fast e5. But against knight d7, that is not an option. That is very true, but the knight on d7 is a little passive. So once again, I don't think many people play like that. Knight f3, d6, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, bishop takes, knight takes, castles, knight gf6. And yeah, there's two options, like I mentioned earlier. One is this rook e1, c3 and d4 position. Say rook e1, e6, c3, bishop e7, d4. Takes, d5, e5, knight e4, knight bd2, which I think is very interesting for white. It's just not in my style, so I probably wouldn't do it. I would go for rook e1 and c4, or even queen e2 and c4, but probably rook e1 and c4, tending to get some sort of Maroczy bind to get knight c3, d4, take back with a knight, go b3, f3, bishop b2, and enjoy my space advantage. After c4 they can play knight e5, but then white goes d3, knight to c3, bishop to f4, and I think his position is quite playable as well. So that's what I would do, but the usual disclaimer, I'm not a 1e4 player and I'm not trying to become one, so I always take my 1e4 recommendations with a grain of salt. Nick2504 is asking, hi Jan, did you enjoy your film last night? I liked it, Jurassic World. Yeah, it's a bit dumb, but I had a good time. It's built for the big screen, and yeah, I always enjoy watching dinosaurs. So yeah, I actually had a good time. What do you recommend for white in the line d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, 4 c5, the Tarrasch. I have to correct you, that's the Semi-Tarrasch, that's not the Tarrasch. And 4 bishop b4, playing a kind of Nimzo. That's one of the biggest lines out there, the Ragozin. That's what every world-class player is playing nowadays. So I don't think I can do both, but I can have a look at the Semi-Tarrasch. d4, how do you get there? d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and c5. It's not a bad line, actually. C takes d. I've played c takes d4 here myself, lost against Wang Hao, but I wouldn't blame the opening. So c takes d is a playable move, queen d4, e takes d, and e4 is the main line, where black gets slightly worse, but tenable endgame after bishop b4. But what they normally do is cd, knight d5. Here, yeah, the principal move is e4, knight c3, b takes c, cd, cd. You called it a verse version of the Grunfeld yourself, yeah, which might be true. Bishop takes, queen takes, castles. Here, the main move used to be bishop c4 for many years. Recently, there's been a bit of a fashion movement towards rook c1, which I think could be a better move. Not committing the position of this bishop yet. Black normally goes, or should go, b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, and castles. And yeah, this position is not so easy for black. So I believe this is the way to go. Try this rook c1 move. Check out recent games. Levon Aronian has been playing this. This is very interesting for white. As for your other question, this 4 bishop b4 line, yeah, this is the main line of top chess at the moment. Check out some games by Topalov and by Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from Norway Chess. They've shown some very interesting ideas there. Leo Vieira 86 is saying, hi Jan, I have just picked up the Taimanov after watching Robin's outstanding series. Yeah, I liked it too. However, the series does not give you a line for black against the Mora Gambit. I have been crushed a few times after accepting the Gambit, so I was wondering if you have any trusted weapon against it. Thank you in advance. Well, I'm lazy, so I like to make my life easy. I'm not quite sure what Robin recommended, but I believe against this, he covered the c3 Sicilian and gave c3 knight f6, right? and this stuff. Which, yeah, is also what I play. I think this is quite solid. So why not make your life a bit simpler and play the same against the Mora Gambit? After d4 cd, you go c3, knight f6. White is nothing better than e5, knight d5. And you get the same position after c takes d. You go d6, knight f3, e6. And take it from here. I believe this is a very solid setup and a way to spoil the fun for the Mora Gambit players. I think that's, of course you can accept the pawn, but that would be my lazy solution to the problem. Boardkeeper is asking, hi Jan, I have been seeing some rather odd move 2 choices in my games. Sounds good. d4, knight f6, bishop f4 seems quite popular at the moment. Really? How would you suggest handling the next phase of the game? I usually continue it in a King's Indian defense fashion with g6, bishop g7, d6 and e5, trying to use white's bishop placement against him. Yeah, I think it depends on what your normal opening preferences are. Earlier I was talking about d4, d6, bishop f4, that's an even better version. So for me, after bishop f4, yeah, I would probably either go c5, I think that's a very decent move, or go d5 and then follow it up with c5 next move after e3, I guess what they do, c5. But I'm more of a Queen's Gambit or play in the center, classical type of player. Well, if you are a King's Indian player, yeah, by all means you should go g6, bishop g7, d6 and take it from there. You probably have a repertoire as a King's Indian player against the London system anyway. And I don't think that starting with bishop f4 helps white's chances there. I haven't studied it much. I have a feeling after bishop f4, c5 should be a good move. Maybe there's probably some games by the experts like Richard Rapport here after knight a6 or something like that, or queen a5 check. But I have a feeling this should be very fine for black. So I'm quite surprised there's such a sharp increase in popularity of 2 bishop f4, but I'll look into it. Axel Banzeas, hi Jan, can white grab an edge in the Pseudo-Panov? Oh no, he doesn't even say hi Jan. I'm sorry. Thanks a lot, Mr. Jan. I've spoken a bit about it earlier, not necessarily grab an edge, but I think it's an interesting line, e4, c6, c4, d5, and then take on d5 twice. I don't think white can grab an edge, but then again you could argue white can't grab an edge anywhere. I do think that both knight c3, knight d5, knight f3 here, and bishop b5 check are interesting lines to play, and white has as good a chance of grabbing an edge as in most major opening systems. So yeah, I don't think it's a bad line to play, at least once in a while. Yoga Nidra is saying, sorry I'm rushing a bit, but we're already 2 hours in and it seems like there's a bunch of more questions. I might have to split those things up or do multiple parts or just stop answering questions at one point. Anyway, let's keep going for a bit. Yoga Nidra saying, hi Jan, I've been a bit confused by the lines d4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, bishop g7, queen d3, and d4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, bishop f4. Why would he be confused by those? Do you have some recipe for not running into white's traps here? Yeah, I think that is a recipe. Don't run into white's traps and you'll be fine, because the white moves aren't the most natural moves of the world. Having said that, I don't know that many traps. I know after bishop f4 you really shouldn't play knight bd7, because then knight b5 is posing a lot of problems, but I do think you can go c5 and black is fine. After e3, c takes d, knight b5 doesn't work here because of queen a5 check, so you have to go e takes d with white. Now you play a6, just stopping any shenanigans. Then you go knight c6, get the bishop out to g4 or f5, and there's really no problems. So that's the short version on bishop f4. The other line looks even more goofy. Bishop g5, knight d7, queen d3. I think anything is fine. I think g6 here is fine, and after e4 take and go bishop g7. The most principled, as usual, is c5. There was a recent game between who was it? Nakamura and Kayakin, long castle, c4, queen g3, queen a5. And I'd already take black. You just push your b pawn up the board. Even after e4, I think you just go b5, playing b4, starting a very early counter-attack. So yeah, I don't think either of those lines is very scary, but bishop f4 is of course a more normal move, so this is playable for white. That's all I know on these things. Cristiano Pierre Andre. Hi Jan, I'm writing from my mobile phone. Oof, he wrote a long text for being on his mobile phone. And he doesn't know. Okay, too long. My question is, what opening should I play as black against players who play slow systems with c4, g3 without d4, with d3? Depends on what you do against one d4. He says, I play Nimzo, French and Nimzo, and various Queen's Gambit declines. Thanks to your banter blitzing, I discovered that Queen's Gambit declines are cool. Not sure how cool they are, but e6 doesn't seem very good against one c4. I disagree. I think e6 is the lazy man's approach to one c4 if you're a Queen's Gambit player. I'd like to unbalance the game and punish them for the lack of ambitions. Lack of ambitions. Every world-class player, have you seen Norway chess? They're all playing one c4 now. Anand, Aronian, Grishuk, and so on. So yeah, I don't think it's for lack of ambition. I don't have the patience to play the hedgehog, and I tried one e5 with c6, but I don't know what kind of advantage should I try to obtain. Thanks. Yeah, I think you should not underestimate the move one c4. It's a very playable move, and thinking of an advantage for black is a bit strong. I've always felt that either e5 here or after knight f6, knight c3, e5 was the most logical way to play, just grabbing space in the center, and then this line which Jan Ludwig Hammer played over and over in Norway chess, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, d5. I always felt this was the principal way to play, but it's not everyone's cup of tea, and I'm not sure how much I would like it with black, and it's certainly a bit of work here. Well, if I was a Queen's Gambit player, I would just play e6, and I wouldn't be too concerned about these systems while playing d4. You just have to learn a line here, either d takes c4 or bishop e7. I tend to play bishop e7, castles. Yeah, if they go, well, d3 is not really a move here, and if they play something like this, it's another system. It's sometimes played, but it's nothing to be scared of. So, yeah, my lazy solution would absolutely be to go c4, e6 as a Queen's Gambit player. If you're more ambitious, yeah, I would look into e5 and probably the main line with knight f6 and d5 and take it from there. Those are the two things I would do, given your repertoire. Kevin Connolly 9465 is saying, Hi Jan, I'm not the guy from Entourage. I did figure that out, but he will sign a picture and nobody has to know. Thanks a lot. Haven't watched the movie yet, but I certainly will soon. And I should really remember to switch back so you guys can read the whole text. In the Grunfeld, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, cd5, knight d5, e4, knight c3, bc, bishop g7. Too long. I will just read it in my mind. What's currently going on? I enjoy playing this line, even though I keep reading white is a bit better. Maybe I'm just stubborn. In German 2 from Hanau. He's German 2 from Hanau. And as a kid, the nearby library only had Grunfeld books. That sounds like a horrible childhood. Things would be much easier if I never saw these books. So let's see. That's another question I'm not prepared for yet. Normally I stop preparing like an hour before the show, and I haven't seen everything. But this line, how up to date am I here? First thing is that white normally doesn't go for this. This bishop c4 thing had its spur of popularity, but the problem from a white perspective is black has so many good systems here. Queen c7 is a good system, b6 is a very good system, knight a5 followed by b6 is also a decent system, bishop g4, f3, bishop d7 I think is a very good system, which I think Svidler has recommended. So there's no real point for black to keep going for this main line. I would be less scared of bishop f7 than of bishop d3 if I was black. But that might be ignorance. So takes, king f1. I was reading these Kasparov books recently, and as usual I can't remember much of the details. But he was arguing, and I think he was right, that this old system he played against Karpov with queen d6 sort of solves all of black's problems. So it might be worth checking out those books if your local library has them, and follow Gary with queen d6 or cd queen d6. And the other line with cd e5, I've played this once years ago against Pinter, I believe, but I haven't revisited it since. My last position was that black is supposed to be alright and supposed to be holding, and I still had a tough time like going e5 and allowing d5, this pass pawn in the center, and locking in my bishop. So nowadays, well, I haven't looked at this line for a long time because I wouldn't go knight a4 with bishop g4 anymore. But yeah, what caught my attention was that Kasparov mentioned this idea with queen to d6. And he sounded quite confident about it, so that's what I would be checking out. But once again, there's really no reason to go for this knight a5 stuff. You have to know too much, both about bishop d3 and bishop f7. Just go here, then go here, put a rook in the center, and you have a good position. Anyway, that's my take on it. Thanks Kevin Connolly for the question. Thomas Legend is asking, hi Jan, what is your recommendation for white to the moves 1 d4 d6? I'm not a big fan of knight f3 as it doesn't fit into my repertoire. Thanks a lot. I do believe I've also had this question before. Maybe we've discussed all the world's opening questions already and we're stuck in a loop. If you don't like knight f3, I normally play knight f3, but then by all means go c4. After e5, play knight c3. Check out the recent game by Erwin Lamy against Shak Mamedyarov from the Reykjavik Open. After e takes d, queen d4, knight c6, queen d2. White wants to go b3, bishop b2, then g3, bishop g2, and gets a reasonably pleasant position with his double fianchetto and his control of the center. That is absolutely playable, and that's what I would be doing if I would not like to knight f3 or to e4 for repertoire reasons. Huchjoch is saying, hi Jan, I have a question to the Panov. e4, c6, d4, d5, takes, c4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, bishop g5, dc, bishop c4. Black has a choice, queen d4 or h6, for example, bishop h4, queen d4. Could you explain which move you prefer and where the differences are? Nah, it's too late for that, but I do know a little bit. I don't prefer either of those moves. I've never studied it in all that much detail. I normally go for the boring e6 here, which I think is an underrated line. Knight f3, bishop e7, and I think black is fine. c5 castles, and then you want to go knight e4 and or b6, and I think white is nothing. But yeah, bishop g5, dc is certainly the trendy line. Bishop c4. I would go h6 when I'm not sure what the differences are, frankly. But there are some, like after bishop h4, queen d4, knight d4, long castles, e5. It favors black that this bishop is already on h4 and not on g5 anymore. The bishop controls less ground as g5 in some lines. And yeah, I haven't checked this for a long time, but I think black is supposed to be fine here after knight f3 takes. But honestly, I'm not that sure about it because I haven't checked it for a long time. Like, I'm sure black is supposed to be fine, but I'm not sure about the moves, is what I'm trying to say. While this other line, without h6, bishop h4, I believe black is also supposed to be fine, but it is a lot more double-edged. Castles, e5. Once again, I don't know what they do, but I think they go f4 here, which was the critical line. And this works here with the bishop on g5, but it wouldn't work so well in the position after h6, bishop h4, queen d4, takes, long castles, e5, f4. Maybe it does, actually. I'm really not a big specialist. bishop g4, but I would assume that this inclusion does change things in black's favor. But once again, this sounds like one has to invest more work. It's not a line I play, so I'm not that sure. What you have to be aware of is that after h6, white is allowed to go bishop e3. People have played that with a normal sort of isolated pawn's position, and even bishop f4 has been tried. And I think black is best advised to also go e6, bishop d6, and he's solid, but white has a bit more choice after dc4 and h6. Still, that is the line a lot of the experts prefer nowadays, so it's probably good, and they checked it in detail. I'm not quite sure. I would normally go e6 after bishop g5, and I think that's fine for black as well. Okay, what else we got? Mike 1951 is saying, "Hi Jan, I routinely play a friend in my chess club who plays this system with black regardless of white moves. d6, knight f6, knight d7, e5, c6, bishop c7, queen c7, etc. Some of the move order can be different, but it ends up the same. As a d4 player, how would you proceed against this?" I don't know, just get my pieces out. I like system players that always do the same. Normally they don't fight much for the center and you get a pleasant position out of the opening, right? So what does he do? He goes d6, knight f6, knight d7, e5, c6, and queen c7. Okay, let him do it. Just develop. Now, I guess he goes bishop e7, but yeah. Could also go g6. Here white has a very pleasant choice between many different setups. Queen c2, rook d1, then bishop to g5 and rook c1. It's a good setup. I have a bit of a soft spot for systems with bishop e3 as well. Not sure here, maybe knight g4 is a problem, but even that doesn't look very convincing. Then trying to go d5 and knight d2. And there's a very typical setup to just go rook e1, castles, whatever. Bishop f1. Normally black goes a6, white does nothing, goes a3, b5, a3. And white always maintains a bit of an edge in these positions by just grabbing more space. Follow up with bishop g5, rook c1, and you'll always be a bit better. So yeah, if you don't want to play for tricks to exploit his move order, that's probably what I would do. If you do want to play for tricks, I'm not sure. You could try something like e4, knight c3, knight bd7, and f4, a system like that. Those are very aggressive. But yeah, I tend to be happy to see black develop in such a way because he gives up a lot of flexibility, especially with the early knight bd7. Most King's Indian lines, that's not the right square for the knight who wants to go to c6 or a6. So I'd be happy to see them do that. But of course it is legal and you're not going to win out of the opening immediately. Carpa Blanca is saying, Jan, I'm a 1900 FIDE USCF player who just recently switched from d4 to e4. Why would you do that? My general question is this: do you suggest non-masters switch opening system or stick to one while they learn the other parts of chess? My specific question is this: for a player more comfortable in maneuvering games, what lines are strong against the Sicilian? Once again, why would you switch from d4 to e4, especially if you're more comfortable in maneuvering games? That I'm not sure about. But to answer the question, yeah, against the Sicilian, well, that's my problem. That's why I don't play e4. That's why I'm a d4 guy, because I'm not that comfortable there. But yeah, I would probably try to take a page out of Magnus Carlsen's playbook and play bishop b5 against knight c6. And against d6, that leads to more maneuvering, slower positions. Against e6, it's a bit more tricky, but you could, for example, play g3. That's what Carlsen has been playing. And try to get into slower territory there as well. And the general question, I don't think there's a rule of thumb to stick to one opening or to switch systems. The only thing I advise against is to switch between different sidelines because you're not happy with them after one game. That's something you should not do. But more or less, yeah, I always advise people to play main lines and stick with them because it just gives you more of a chess education, which will lead to better results in the midterm. Else, if you switch openings or stick to one, I think there's no correct answer to that. I'm curious though why you would switch from d4 to e4 as a 1900 player. That sounds like a very radical measure. You could add e4 to your repertoire, but to switch completely sounds quite strong to me. And last question for today is by Tristram Shandy. Hello Jan, first I would like to tell you that your shows on comments on chess24.com are great. I enjoy them very much. Thank you so much. After the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, Ruy Lopez Berlin. The main line is knight takes e4. I think the move bishop c5 is also well known. Now my question, what is your opinion about the move for bishop e7 instead? Looks a little passive to me, but I found that Laius Portage and even Nigel Short played this sometimes. Where do you see the disadvantages or advantages for black in this bishop e7 line? I don't have the slightest clue. It's the first time I've ever heard of the move bishop e7 in that position. And that's strange because I have a bit of a fetish for Spanish sidelines, so I'm surprised I've never heard about it. Could be that it's for good reason. I know this is me making chess theory up on the go. Could knight c3 be a problem here? I'm threatening bishop c6 and knight takes e5. So I guess you have to go d6, and then I would go d4, e takes d, knight takes d4, bishop d7, bishop takes c6, b takes c, and queen f3. I think I've had a similar position earlier by a very different move order with a pawn on a6. But these positions tend to be better for white and also a bit passive for black. So I believe this is probably a problem, even though I just made up this line. I've never seen the move bishop e7. But I wouldn't be surprised if this was a problem. And also I'm not sure, once again I don't know theory here, if white just goes rook e1 with a typical Spanish plan of c3 and d4, what the point is. So it's probably not a terrible move, but I don't think I'll become a fan. And yeah, my first instinct would be that this knight c3 and d4 could be a bit of a problem. So that's it for today. Hopefully have answered your questions in destroying the studio in the finale in a way that we all learned something. It's been a bit of a marathon. I'll think about the format if we're gonna split it up in the future. I'm sorry I've ignored the chat, but you can see that I've been quite busy talking. Thank you so much for your attention. I do hope that someone out there could hear and see me. If not, tough luck. And I'll see you guys next time or tomorrow ready for more comments on the Dortmund Super Tournament together with Maximilian Meinhardt. It's been a pleasure. See you next time. Bye bye.